Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the NETA webinar, a conversation about Asian American discrimination, Silent No More. I want to welcome you all, welcome our panel to this webinar and this discussion. I look forward to a good conversation about this issue of Asian Americans. I want to thank everyone at NETA, the business development, my assistant Julie, and of course my partners and associates for their support and for allowing me to do these webinars. In a moment I'll introduce the panel, but I just want to give a brief statement. I wasn't aware of the extent of Asian discrimination in the United States. In March, of course, we had a horrific incident in Atlanta, and after that, the spotlight really turned on the Asian American population, and particularly the amount of violence and acts of violence against them. And it was an eye-opening experience for me to learn more about it. I've read about it since, particularly a new book called Facing the Mountain by Daniel Brown, and I've attended several other webinars like this. The Mass Business Roundtable had one, and Representative Chan and Grace Lee were on that panel. And that was right after Atlanta. And that was a very sobering, eye-opening conversation. And so I thought, I'd like to continue that. I'd like to learn more and expose the issue more. So I reached out to my friends who are on the panel here today, Grace Lee and Representative Chan and Shirley Leong and Nam Pham, and asked them if they would participate with me in this discussion, and I welcome them each today. There's a few statistics that I've seen, essentially from one of Shirley's articles, that 8.9% of the Asian American population is similar in size to the Black population in Greater Boston. The poverty rate among Asian American households in Boston is higher than some Black households, and nearly 3 times higher than white households. This next point is very interesting. Disparities within the Asian American community are enormous, often reflecting the wide range of immigration paths from refugees to employment-based visas. Less than a third of Vietnamese and Cambodians in Massachusetts have a college degree, compared with 80% or more of Korean, Japanese, and Indian Americans. The overall median household income in Greater Boston is $85,000, but within the Asian American community, the median range from a low of about $60,000 for Nepalese families to a high of nearly $130,000 for Indian families. So just some statistics that I came across, and I thought they would be interesting. I would like to introduce our panel and thank them. Representative Taki Chan, Chairman of the Joint Committee on Consumer Protection and Professional Licensure in the Massachusetts Legislature, and represents the Suffolk-Norfolk District from Quincy. Ms. Grace Lee, Senior Vice President, Director of Government Banking, People's United Bank, former General Counsel to the State Treasurer of Massachusetts, Tim Cahill, and that's when we met, and was Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Civil Rights Division. Shirley Leong, the columnist and Associate Editor of the Boston Globe. You may also hear her on WGBH, as I often do. And Mr. Nam Pham, President of the Vietnamese American Volunteers Association, and also serves in the real estate department of MassDOT. And he and his wife have been longtime friends of mine. And so I welcome you all today and thank you all for joining me. Thank you very much. I'd like to start our questions today. The first broad question for all the panel, and it is, would you please describe your experience and that of your family as an Asian American? And the coincidence, before I have Taki start us off on this, the coincidence is yesterday's New York Times, page A12, 2 pages of reflections by Asian Americans to the question, how it feel, a statement, how it feels to be an Asian in today's America. And it's 24 reflections of Asian American people. And of course, it's just so timely that it was in yesterday's paper, getting ready for today's discussion. And it's just fascinating when you see the diverse reactions of Asian Americans. So if you haven't seen that, to the audience and to the panel, it's just very interesting and really shows the range of impacts on the Asian American community. So Taki, could you start us off with, would you please describe your experience? How do you assess and describe or explain the discrimination? And what is the situation today? If you want to start us off, we're very grateful.
Thank you very much, Bill, and everyone that came online to watch us. And Grace and Nam are very old friends at this point, and Shirley's more of a new friend at this point. But one of the interesting things, talking to particularly Grace and Nam over the years, is our different experiences as Asian Americans growing up in different places in different time periods. So Grace is a West Coast person. I'm Quincy born through. Nam is a refugee, and Shirley, I believe, is out of Chicago. So we actually have very different Asian experiences. And I'll say right off the bat, as a child, we didn't call ourselves Asian Americans. We were Chinese, and more specifically from Hong Kong. And the concept of Asian Americanism really didn't appear to me until I got to college in the 90s. So it's a very different challenge. And in my case, I lived more in a social isolation period. I grew up in an old Quincy where there was very people of color at all, much less anyone looks like me. First kid to go to a public school that was Asian or Chinese, first Chinese kid at St. Anne's, first families in my neighborhood. We didn't have this large social support network of families. Our families scattered around the world. So I didn't have this, a lot, you see these immigrant families together and, treated a little bit differently. My name is Taki Chan, for Pete's sakes. I mean, we didn't give me a name that is a European name. We stuck to a Wei Giles. You can look up Wei Giles on your own, but Wei Giles romanization of my name from my family. And this was actually very important to my grandmother, my father's mother, who actually gave me my name, that we hold to being who we are, the Chinese folks that live here, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. But as a child growing up, I wish I was everybody else, because all my friends were Irish and Italians. I know about Irish and Italians more than I know about Chinese in Quincy. And growing up was you're on your own. As Bill has heard me say before, I represent a district that threw rocks at me as a child, and I haven't left. And you had to be a little bit tough, but you're also smart. You don't fight people when you're like 15-1. You try to get out of the way. And as a result, those scars are long lasting on realizing that you're on your own. There's no family member to rescue you. There's no neighbor to rescue you in many ways, although I had some wonderful neighbors that kept an eye on us. But I mean, they can't keep an eye on you all the time. And growing up in Quincy as an advocate for Asian American issues in the 90s, late 90s, right to the 2000s, it was hard. People didn't accept there was a problem. People liked the fact that you couldn't be seen. And challenging the political establishment got me in hot water more than one time. And, I've been boiled and singed more than once in this business. And I know what it's like to be blacklisted. So, being an advocate, and sometimes the only advocate for a population of 12,000 Asians during the early 90s, is a lonely place to be sometimes. And I had support of like 3 or 4 friends that were great. But, I persevered on to point out things that were wrong. And, I obviously, you all know I got into politics and government, and even running for office, the perpetual outsider was persistent. People, first question was asked was, where was it born? Where was it really born? Or where I'm really from? And how great my English is. I mean, I packed my car at Harvard Yard to get a cup of chowder. I mean, you can't get more Quincy native than me. Because I remember what everything is my neighborhood before, and I was shocked people I could name things that were there 35 years ago. So, it's a very different experience from some other folks, and I'm sure other people's very different experiences from me. But I am very aware of what it's like to be left out of the conversation, very aware of not being part of the picture, very aware of being alone, left alone, and very aware of being ignored, thinking that your voice is irrelevant. And to me, that's a big part of the silent struggle, or sometimes the loud struggle that no one hears, of being an Asian American, or I like to call it Chinese more than anything else these days.
Well, thank you. Thanks. But you've taken those experiences and put that into public life and part of leadership in the legislature, and you're an advocate for consumers, and you're an advocate for your community. So you've taken that and you put that to use effectively.
Well, continue to be a number of firsts, right, Bill? I mean, I'm the first person of color, much less Asian or Chinese, elected in the city of Quincy, the first successful election. And I'm the first Asian American to reach a leadership position in the House of Representatives as the chairman. And right now, I'm the most senior person of color in the House leadership structure. Frank Moran is the other person of color, as well as Bud Williams, but I got a few more years of seniority than they do. And Bill knows very well the value of seniority in the State House. Yeah. So people don't recognize that, right? They even the governor's inaugural address, they point to the Black Latino caucus as having more seniority people than myself. And this is, again, this kind of great awareness need to be had about our success. And first time, people always shocked there was no Asians elected before in the House. I'm like, have you not noticed, or you just never thought about it, right?
Thank you. Grace, would you please share your experience with us?
Sure. First, thank you, Bill, for doing this. And I want to thank the panelists. I've admired them in their professional, personal journeys. So it really is an honor to be here. And thanks, Nutter, because Nutter also is very supportive of the programs that you put on. So I appreciate all the support. I think, the chairman kind of highlighted the experiences are defined by the environment that you exist in. I'm Korean American, and I usually use this line as almost like a cliff note or a summary tagline, so people understand the context of what I experienced. I'm the product of the LA riots. Grew up in Los Angeles, and on the West Coast, there's a heightened awareness of anti-Asian sentiment, discrimination, because the history there is still so very surface. So, from the 1800s, from building of the railroads, you had a series of historical anti-Asian events that kind of, define and, frame where we are today. 1800s, you start with the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusionary Act. When economic times became hard after the railroads were built, you had a scapegoating of Chinese labor, where they blamed the economic hardships on the Chinese that came in, and they burnt a lot of the Chinatowns within the West Coast and going into the Midwest. So you also have on the West Coast, Angel Island. It's the equivalent of Ellis Island here on the East Coast. And you also have the backdrop of the Japanese internment camp. This is all very surface when it comes to the Asian community on the West Coast. Tacky and I talk about this all the time. My best friend growing up, Japanese American family, her grandparents were detainees at Manzanar. And you see her father and mother, both sides. You see just very dramatically how, these historical events have an impact on a family. On the father's side, there was a neighbor that actually took care of the property and the businesses. So when they came back from being detained in the internment camps, they actually had something to come back for. On the mother's side, because you had 36 hours to collect your belongings and take care of your things, otherwise it was deemed abandoned, they came back to nothing. So given that backdrop, it's a different experience than Tacky's had. But with that being said, that was my formative years. LA riots, you had social unrest and an entire community and a nation that reacted to the Rodney King riots, where you had an entire community, and these were, systemic institutional decisions. They decided that law enforcement, the fire department they purposely created a perimeter, and they were not going into Koreatown. So that meant, my contemporaries back then, high school, junior high, kids that lived in the suburbs were handed guns by their parents and said, hey, we need to go and protect our stores. So these incidents of today kind of are, a continuum of things that I think a lot of people have been experiencing. So, but I'm going to fast forward, because when you ask about experiences, well, my formative years were on the West Coast, which is fundamentally different from the chairman's experience. Professionally, everything I've done has been on the East Coast. So from a professional perspective, I'll highlight 3 professional events, because I think that kind of underscores the stereotypes Asian Americans are, subjected to chronically. The first day in the DA's office, and it was actually the DA's office, I was chief of civil rights unit. You gave me a promotion, Bill, and I thank you for that. But the first day I started in the DA's office, a defense attorney said, do you have any naked pictures of yourself? And I remember being completely dumbfounded, because I didn't know what to do with it, because I've always committed that I was going to go into civil rights. I didn't have a response, and that kind of, and that backdrop kind of, sets the stage to one of the stereotypes that Asian American, especially Asian American females, are subjected to, is a hypersexualization. You saw that play out in the Atlanta shootings. And then the second incident is when I was doing a bail argument for a particular judge, and I said, good morning, Your Honor, Grace Lee for the Commonwealth. Full session, packed courtroom, and the judge stopped and said, Lee, any relation to Bruce Lee? So I most respectfully said, most respectfully, Your Honor, Bruce Lee's Chinese, I'm Korean, but if I could direct your attention back to the bail argument. Now, that underscores the stereotype that, we're all one homogeneous monolithic group. There's no distinction. And we kind of talked about that before, surely. And so, the third incident is when I was actually, this was a long time ago, it's 40 Under 40, the National Association of Asian American Attorneys. I was getting an award, and I was on a plane, I was with my child, and I had to take my child, who was, an infant/toddler back then, to the restroom. And I moved over to the side because there was a line, and there was another woman in front of me, and the attendant actually leaned to the person in front of me and said, just tell her you're in front. I don't think she speaks English. This is without even looking at me, talking to me. And so she, and I'm like, I think I heard that, but it's loud on the airplane, right? Especially by the engine. And so I was processing that. And then the lady in front of me said, nice necklace, because clearly if you can't speak English, you're deaf too. See? And so I said, and so with kid in, tow, I said, did she just say I couldn't speak English? To which this lady is like, oh, I want none of this. She goes, yep, she said it, not me. And I had a couple of words with her. But again, now that particular incident underscores the perpetual foreigner, notwithstanding the fact that Asian Americans have been here from the 1800s. So from personal formative years on the West Coast to professional experiences. And I'm most certain that all of us have more stories than you have time for. But I think those are, are prime examples of how Asian Americans, and especially women, are consistently subjected to these stereotypes. So I'll stop there, because you've got a full agenda.
Well, thank you, Grace. That book I referred to, Facing the Mountain, that does talk about the railroad and the post Pearl Harbor and the internment camps. At the same time, Japanese were in the service for the United States. So that's an interesting book, and you touched on a bit of the history. Shirley Young, would you please share your experience with us a little bit?
Sure. And Bill, echoing everyone else, thank you for holding this
Welcome.
session. You know, a lot of this happened in the spring and then it's kind of died down. So it's great that you're keeping this issue about the Asian American community and what we're going through alive well into the fall. And it's great to be on this Zoom with Nam and Taki and Grace. So I want to talk about, I was thinking about my own experience as an Asian American. So I am, you know, I grew up middle class. My dad was a doctor. They were immigrated here. They came here in 1971. And back then, I think the borders were just opening for Asians like my parents, and they saw America as the promised land. And even though they spoke very little English, they decided we are going to, you know, settle in America and raise a family. And actually, it was not in Chicago; it's in Baltimore. I ended up growing up in Baltimore, a little bit more east, not the middle of the country, but the East Coast, in Maryland. And like Taki, my experience, you know, growing up, I was one of only a handful of Asian Americans. And back then we didn't call ourselves Asian American, we call it Chinese, you know, we consider ourselves Chinese. I'm also, my dad's Cantonese. My mom is families from Central China. So my family, my father's family, they fled China after Mao came into power in 1949. So my father's family went to Hong Kong. My mother's family went to Taiwan. My grandfather was actually in the army, Chiang Kai-shek's army. And so and then my parents met in Taiwan, where my dad went to medical school. And then they came to the US. And so my dad actually spent most of his career, almost, close to 40 years working for the Veterans Administration. He was a doctor and took care of a lot of Vietnam War veterans. Anyway, so my experience is actually, when I think about it, as it's lonely. There weren't a lot of other Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, but we did tend to stick together and form a community. I think of myself as very much an immigrant, an immigrant experience and in America. And one of the things that I think is that I've struggled with, I'm a journalist. And when I look at my family, I'm the only person who's not an engineer, who's not a doctor, who's not in tech. And the pressure was really great for me not to be a journalist and not to do what I do. I tell this story about my boss, the editor of the paper, Brian McGrory, and where he tells a story about when he got his first job at the Globe, I don't know, over 3 decades ago. He grew up in, I think, the South Shore of Weymouth. He came back and worked his way to, a job at the Globe. And the first day that, his parents saw his byline in the Globe, they cried, and then when my parents, conversely with my parents, when they were like, oh my God, my daughter's going to be a journalist, they're crying, thinking like, oh, she's going to be so poor. She has no future. What is she doing with her life? And so I've had, struggled. And meanwhile, I'm 25, I'm at the Boston Globe, but when I'm at the Boston Globe when I was, very young, I also worked at the Wall Street Journal all before I was 30, but my parents did not care. They were like, you really should be doing something else with your life. I mean, now that now that I'm a lot older, they're a lot older, they've mellowed over time and they don't think I'm, the black sheep of the family anymore. So that is, it's very interesting because when I mentor young journalists and often, the Asian American, I ask them, I said, what do your parents think about you being a journalist? Are you struggling with that? And often they say yes. And so I say, listen, don't, just tell your parents that you are, you love being a journalist, you love writing, you're still exploring, like, you don't need to have that conversation with them right now. Follow your heart on what, and follow your passion right now. You are so young. You don't have to decide what's your career now. So don't have that fight with your parents yet. But I think some of that is still going on right now. But that's what it's like. That's been my experience as a Chinese American, the daughter of immigrants here. And one last thought is that when I think about the past year and all the hate crimes against Asian Americans, especially the murders in Atlanta, I think about my parents, and if they were, 25 and living in Taiwan, and the year is 2021, would they make that same decision to come and live in America? And I don't know if they would. I think they would stay in Asia. I'm not sure if they would come and raise their family and here in America. And that troubles me, because what makes America so amazing is this melting pot of people. And so we have to find our way on the other side of this.
Thank you, Shil. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Nam Pham, would you please speak a few minutes?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Bill. It's good to be among friends, sharing our experience. I came to the US when I was 19 as a refugee. So my experience, I guess each of us has a different experience. Coming to America as a refugee, I felt very grateful for the generosity of American people. Along my way of my 40+ years in the US, I have had many people helping me to be what I am, who I am. However, there are also a number of situations which make me feel continue to be an outsider, like Taki has mentioned. I remember my first impression of America was, is this America? Because I first landed in Arkansas, and then when I in the refugee camp, and after leaving the refugee camp, the bus took me go through Fort Smith, and that's not what America I had in mind. It's not Los Angeles, it's not Hollywood, it's not New York City. That's what I thought about America. Our perception, our belief are shaped by the media, and I learned over the last many years that the media has not been very kind to Asian American males. Right? If you look at the image or the movies of anything about Asian males, most often that character is not sexy, is not a leadership type, he's not trustworthy, he's a weakling. Yeah. So those perceptions more or less instill in a lot of us. So during my many years here, I always had to deal with that and reconcile my own value, my own custom, try to fit in, also try to prove to others that I am as much as American as you are, or I can be even more American than you are. Shirley mentioned about the melting pot of America. I think that's a good popular metaphor for other immigrant groups who come into America. But for Asian American, I don't think we can be melted. I very often been asked, just like Taki, where I'm from, or I'm often to be mistaken to be Taki, even though you can see Taki is much younger, much better looking man than I am. But often when I walk into the State House, people would greet me as Your Honor. So I think for being an Asian male in the U.S., you have more challenges than any other males. And I mentioned that I have to reconcile my own value and custom to function in America. For example, we are taught, Asians are taught that we have to be polite, we have to be humble. That's the number one virtue that you must have. So I do not know how to sell myself. I cannot tell you that, oh, I'm very good at this. I may be the best thing, I can do the best certain things, but I'm still say, oh, I'm okay, I can do it, you know. But that doesn't work very well in America. Let me stop here, and I can share more about other stuff.
Just one follow-up question. First of all, my advice is don't lose your humility. But two is you gave an interview in the Boston Globe 2.5 weeks ago regarding the Afghanistan's refugees who are coming to America. And there's some coming to Dorchester in the same area where you and I are familiar with. Just briefly, what is your advice or concern as they being those Afghanistans assimilate into our communities?
I have no doubt that they will be very successfully integrated into our community, and they can be as productive citizens as any of us can be. The number one challenge for being a refugee is the ghost of the past. The trauma that a refugee has to go through, the loss of homeland, the loss of loved one, the loss of who you are. Suddenly you are in a strange land, you cannot speak the language, you have no idea what's going on around you. So you become a deaf, a mute, and a dumb person just overnight. And all of those trauma experience will stay with the refugee for a long time. So I think if we should pay little attention to the mental health issues of refugees. I often say that surviving is easier than living. For the first 5 years of refugees, every refugee will try to survive, try to settle, try to make a new life. So they will do very well on the surface, learning a language, get a job, go to school, look very normal. But 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, the ghosts of the past will come back and haunt us again. So the sooner we pay attention, the better for us.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank each of you for sharing first question. The next area is the myth. I direct at first to Shirley. There has been, there's Time Magazine recently did a cover story about the Asian Americans, and they talked about that the pervasive model minority myth has helped to obscure the extent of racial violence experienced by Asian Americans in its history. And in this myth, if you could please explain this myth, Shirley, we have this view of the Asian American community, and I think it's on the screen, hardworking, keeping your nose down, like your parents told you, work hard, keep your nose down, stay out of trouble. And as a result, we have a certain image that now we're learning is not what we thought it was. So could you please explain how we should understand this myth?
Wait, okay, I should have prepared a little bit better because I wanted to go back to, but maybe Tacky can help me with the history. The model myth was back in the 60s, right? It was a term that was used during this, I think almost used against us, right? The model myth. And I mean, it's the idea that we're not really a minority, that we don't really, we are not like Black people or Latinos in America. We don't need any help. We're all well educated. We're all well off. I should have, can someone help me?
Okay.
Right, wasn't there something in the 60s,
Yeah.
right? It came out of civil rights, right? The movement.
Right. The model myth minority is actually, it's actually a reprimand for other people of color, including our own community. They set up the model minority myth to show as an example, you know, systemic racism doesn't exist. You exist in your conditions because you lack the self-discipline and ability to pull yourselves up. Look at the Asian Americans. They've come here with nothing, and now they're educated, they're contributing. And it wasn't a compliment so much as a tool to, you know, kind of quell the masses that were fighting for recognition and civil rights. And it is a myth because, you know, even if you played this through and say, okay, all Asians do great in school, et cetera, Asian Americans are excelling in academics. If you look at just the number of Asian Americans in our higher ed Ivy League schools, if that is a measure of success, why are those numbers not being reflected in our boards, in our companies, and at executive levels? Because we're still stymied by the stereotypes of Asian American men being emasculated, Asian American women being hypersexualized, Asian Americans as a community being passive and non-leadership material. So I don't know if Tacky, you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me just add a tad bit to that. Like Grace points out correctly, a lot of these issues start in the West Coast and moves west to east. And the model minority myth is not a Democrat or Republican issue, because Asian Americans have been commonly used as a wedge political issue. You see it again regarding China, and we can talk about China foreign policy a different day, but as a ripple effect on us in the US. And it's not a conservative or liberal thing. They all do it to us. So let's get that out of our heads first. Okay, it's not the right wing, it's the left wing, the right wing, the Dems, the Republicans, they all do it to us. So let's kill that political myth right off the bat. But they also was interesting in my look at the model minority myth. They picked the Japanese first to make them a minority. Do you know why? These guys just came out of internment camps, have been traumatized by the US government. They're the most vulnerable group in America. I mean, really think about it. So they're going to make them the model minority first because they came out with nothing. They lost a lot of stuff. Grace story share of a friend who was fortunate to have a Caucasian family be a trustee of their property, but none of them did not. They lost everything, literally everything. No reparations, dumped on a train in a foreign place, not welcomed home, treated like the enemy, despite the fact their children died in droves for the US government, in the military, with no veteran benefits on their return. People forget that. Not everybody got the GI Bill, folks. Certain people were left out, including the Filipinos. So, you know, there's that whole underlying issue of PTSD done by your own country and your neighbors. So now we're going to make a minority of them. What do you say?
So one of the danger of the model minority is that Asian Americans, our problems are ignored, or our community's problems are ignored. I mean, Bill, you started out the conversation with the poverty level, you know, among Asian Americans. I mean, again, that means that low income households, low Asian American income households aren't getting the help they need because people assume they don't need help. And so that's why it's really, and through Taki's work at the State House, and he is trying to get Asian Americans included in a lot of the conversations, a lot more of the conversations, so that it's not just about helping the Black community or the Latino community. Asian Americans have a lot of problems, and whether it's poverty or getting a college education. I mean, there's this, image that we all went to the Ivy Leagues, or everybody's fighting to go to the Ivy Leagues, but there are a lot of people in Dorchester in the Vietnamese community who have not gone to college. We need to work on that, and so we need to lift everybody.
If I may add one thing, just to follow up with what you said, Shirley, the Cambodian community in law is the second biggest one in the US. And most people do not know that virtually every household, there was no man or single mom, because the man had been killed after the war in those so-called killing field. So that's one thing that I think very few people know that. Just one small issue.
I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
But that makes sense. That's me. I did not know that. Wow. I mean, I did know that Lowell was the second biggest Cambodian population, but I didn't think it was. It didn't occur to me that there's single moms households there.
Let me give you a simple story about disparities. Over a decade ago, now my first week in office, I had a traumatic event where in Germantown, a Chinese mother with severe mental health issues murdered her child in public housing using a hibachi grill and asphyxiated the child. The teenage son was not there. The mom was trying to do a double suicide. This is my first 10 days in office, folks. I'm trudging around Germantown in the snow, trying to figure out what's going on. And after I called my good friend, the district attorney, skedaddled out of there once I saw news trucks. AP News reported that it is commonplace for Asian Americans to commit suicide via hibachi grill. Boston Herald calls me up, asks me for confirmation. I told the Herald, let me get this straight. You want to publish a story, and Shirley knows they can treat the press cruel too. I'm like, you want to publish a story telling us that we sit at our dining room table as a Chinese family using a Japanese device to asphyxiate our children? Is that the lesson you want to tell Americans? That we teach our kids to use suicide devices, hibachi grills? Obviously, the Herald didn't publish that story. Then Channel 5 News grabbed me in front of City Hall in the code and asked that question about the hibachi grill, and I refused to answer that question. But the big horror of that story is that nobody talked about Asian American mental health. I actually know a little bit of background on how she got to the state, and she was deemed criminally insane. And actually, I've got a little bit of information with that family, which I don't need to share with you about what's happening with them. But if this was a Black, Latino, or even a white community this happened to, mental health would be the forefront of the conversation, and assistance and funding and other things would be provided to that area. I promise you. And I've been in this business long enough to see this occur. But because it was a Chinese woman that got a blip of the news, and it was a highlight was hibachi by suicide by hibachi, there was no conversation about this. Now, you all think about it for a second. And you think about all the other ethnicities, Black, Latino, Caucasian. When there's a traumatic event with drugs, suicide, missing teenager. I mean, there's a Vietnamese missing teenager this year. Got zero news story in Boston. She was still missing, but no story. So tell me whether people look like you see that are missing, and where do the focused news stories continue? And I'm not blaming Shirley or the Globe anyway in particular, but it becomes, as Nan points out, the media permeates our minds, right? Permeates our minds about where their priorities lie.
Thank you for that, Taki, and I'm pleased to see that now behavioral health and mental health, as you know, in the legislature, is front and center in the recent healthcare reform bills we've done. So that's the good news, I think. And you in the legislature have done that to put more focus on mental health. And as you in your district, the Bay Cove Mental Health Center and so forth are addressing those issues. So thank you for that on the myth. Grace, you talked a little bit about the business community in your answer about the myth. Could you talk, I referenced earlier about the Wall Street Journal did the NAACP took out an ad in the Wall Street Journal in January calling out to the business community to address issues of diversity and inclusion. How do you see the business community addressing the issues of Asian American discrimination? Do you see a role for the business community? What, and if so, what do you see? You mentioned the boards, you mentioned leadership, but just generally, do you see that the community should become more engaged?
Absolutely. I think there's a critical role for our business community. But before I go there, I don't want to forget to say this. When it comes to the model minority myth and the stereotypes and the images that Asian Americans are subjected to, I have to thank Shirley because she has been relentless about writing about the AAPI community and what we've been going through, and not just writing about the anti-Asian hate crimes, but giving our community dimension and depth and humanity. So I want to give a huge shout out and thank you for that, Shirley.
Thank you,
So,
Grace. Thank
huge
you.
fan, first time caller, long time listener. But let me segue, when it comes to the business community, Stop Asian Hate has a bunch of stats out there. Some of the stats out there is, and I think this might not be as current, Shirley may be able to help me with this, but 63% of discrimination is experienced outside of the household and public. Between 30 to 35 is actually experienced in their place of employment. So if you look at that, it's not just we have a role, it is we have to have a role because we spend most of our living days in our work environment. So what that means is we come into a workplace environment with the information that we were taught. So most of the historic, and I know I like Taki and everybody else that's known me for a long time, I rattle off the historical facts because we're not taught that in our history books. We're not taught that at school. So nobody understands the longevity and the anti-Asian sentiment that Asian American community has faced historically from the 1800s. So I keep pounding that home. So the fact of the matter is, if we are not learning it at school, we're not really learning it anywhere else, and then we're obligated and, if you want to work there, required to interface with a very diverse workforce, hopefully, knock on wood. We all have to coexist, and we have to coexist in a way that's harmonious, genuine, and authentic, that actually values every individual for who they are, what their experiences are, and what they can contribute. So if you look at the business community, I have to say, in the past year and a half, the business community has stepped up in a way that has been unprecedented. You've seen companies support Black Lives Matter. You've seen companies and corporations, throw out the tag Stop Anti-Asian Hate. So when you ask, is there a role? Absolutely, out of necessity. And I think corporations and businesses are embracing that role. And whether we like it or not, where our governments are failing us, the private sector is actually stepping up. Bill, you saw that with the Mass Business Roundtable, with the the forums that we've been having. Bill, you're doing this. This is, all private sector business oriented activity. So when you look at whether it comes from recruiting, you're recruiting in your pipeline for your workforce and development pool, whether it is doing DEI seminars, initiatives, and policies that run systemically throughout the company. I think there's a lot to do. I think this has been an unprecedented year for companies. This is something that I think companies have embraced. So I think that when it comes to every segment, from hiring to benefits to workplace culture and environment to ultimately retirement and whatnot, there is a role for the private sector. And I think while, there's a lot to be done, I think we need to encourage and applaud the steps that the companies and the private sector has taken. The Globe has been awesome. I love that they support you so much, Shirley. People's United Bank has been phenomenal. M&T, we're going to be going through an acquisition. They've been phenomenal. If you look at their social media posts, and it matters, and it matters significantly. And I think everybody on the panel can attest to this when, at the height, and it's still going on. So I say that, with some trepidation at the height of the anti-Asian hate, and I call it a pandemic because it's global. All of us were calling our parents. This is very unusual in that the people that are being targeted are the most vulnerable in our society. And when you talk, there's a lot of things that are not monolithic about our culture, but one thread that is consistent is we honor our elders. We value all of our ancestry. To see the most vulnerable part of our community targeted and helplessly, in some cases murdered, was more than we could bear. So when the companies and the corporations stood up and actually supported the AAPI community, it mattered. And it matters now, and it's going to matter in the future.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you very much. And I think, I had Carol Falk as a guest here a year ago, and she talking about her book, diversity and inclusion is good for business. And I think that when it comes to the Asian community, that same realization that has to occur, that it's right and it's good, and it's as you discussed. So thank you very much for that. Tacky, I'd like you to talk about in the budget for Representative, there's a commission on the status of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It's going to be a permanent commission. It's funded. Could you please talk briefly about this commission and what you hope to achieve in its mission?
The budget amendment actually just changes the name of the commission to be more inclusive of Asian American and the Pacific Islanders. Grace and I have a long journey with this commission back in 2003. When she worked in the Treasurer's Office and I worked in the State Senate with Michael Morrissey to establish the Asian American Commission modeled after the Women's Commission. And it's actually the first statutory commission in Massachusetts addressing a racial group ever by statute. And the governors have had passed Asian American commissions. I actually served at Nam Pham on, as I think, a appointee of Jane Swift or Salucci, I can't remember anymore, onto those commissions. So most people don't realize that the state has had one form or another, some type of Asian commission, but being the first one regarding racial makeup is something, again, a first among all racial groups being Asian American. And the goal of the commission is to give the 7 constitutional officers, the governor, speaker, Senate president, auditor, attorney general, treasurer, and secretary of state, appointments, 3 appointments apiece, to represent our diverse communities, provide feedback to state government, and also be part of our eyes and ears of the community statewide. And the Asian Commission strives to have a large number of diversity on the commission from different Asian ethnic groups to ensure that our voices are heard. I've actually served as the first vice chair and the second chair. Grace has served as the chair at one time of this commission. Its work is continuing. And to give you a little bit of a story behind that one as well, when we were trying to push this commission through 2003, not getting to people's names, but there was a pushback about funding this commission. this was a legitimate pushback I was getting, that we shouldn't fund this commission. I made sure through our good friends in the Senate Friends Office time too, that language would not exist. I've never heard of anybody suggesting a state agency not be funded by state statute. I had to fight to get that language out of there as a staffer. And subsequently, it has not been state funded. It actually did not get state funded until I got elected and made my first attempt in my sophomore year trying to get some things in the budget. But from 2003 to 2012, they had to be self-sufficient and somehow make this work. And Grace and I have been dealing with this issue of unfundedness by state government. And now because of advocacy by the House Asian Caucus, because of the changing times, and also the good work of people like Nam Pham, Grace Lee, and Shirley Young, and also the commissioners, it is now a funded state agency. Now the Black and Latino communities got their commissions also through the police reform bill last year. And they have all kinds of different funding mechanisms and appointments that are different from ours, but also accomplishing a fairly similar mission to bring greater awareness and be the eyes and ears for state government to help craft public policy, and in some cases provide some direct services and support to existing agencies around the state to support our communities.
Representative, before you get off the screen, there's one question I do want to get to. I'm running out of time, but the Black Lives Matter. We referred to other groups in this discussion today. Since George Floyd, great attention, momentum, so forth. Lessons learned for the Asian American community. Anything you take from the Black Lives Matter movement that you think should be adopted or embraced by the Asian community as you tell your story?
Yes, if I may, I think there are a number of lessons that we can learn. One is you need to speak up, and our Asian community tend to speak up less than others, so we need to speak up more. The second thing is you need to have a good alliance with the media, so they could amplify your voice and minimize any mistake you may make. And the third thing that I take from it is also you should not destroy the neighborhood that your people are living in it. I remember in the 80s, I traveled to Korea quite a bit for businesses. And if you remember in the 80s, especially late 80s in Korea, there was demonstration almost every night between thousands and thousands of students against the authoritarian regime. I was there one night. I could still smell the tear gas and all of those things. But the next morning, when I came back to the same place, it looked like nothing has happened. No shop was vandalized, looked clean, neat, and business back to normal. So I think for us to have a more effective voice to represent our voice, our community, and to make a bigger contribution to the bigger community, we need to keep those things in mind.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want to give each of you a moment to make a closing kind of remark, and I'll start with you, Grace, if that's okay. Do you have a sense that the voice of the Asian American community, that the voice that now there's some momentum can be continued and should be continued, of course? And so just as part of your closing remarks, do you have a few words you want to say to us?
First, thank you again, because I think these seminars, venues, and opportunities to share are vital. And yes, I think we can with people like yourself, Bill, and all of our other allies. This is a huge opportunity for the AAPI community, because this is a unique time in our history where we actually have people in visible positions that can actually push through some of the messaging that has been lost historically. While the anti-Asian sentiment is not new and it's been in existence since the 1800s, what is unique is we have reporters like Shirley that is giving voice to our community. We have reporters on CNN, MSNBC. We have representatives in our state, local, and federal government that now can articulate and share experiences and offer solutions that can actually be comprehensive and hopefully sustainable. So yes, I think we can. And quite simply, I think we must. And the business community plays a vital role. And I think has stepped up, as I said before. And I thank you, and I thank all the panelists.
Dom, any final word, message you want to give to the audience?
Very short. For us, we need to continue to speak up, to fight back, and to give back to our community. And the number one thing we can do for us is to continue to create a closer alliance with every group in the country. What is good for us, it's good for everybody.
Taki, Representative Chan, any final words?
No, there's a lot of final words, but never give a mic to a politician too long.
And I know that well. I know that well.
Let me try to see. I'm trying to think of a good final thought. And my final thought of today is this: give a kid a chance, right? Give a kid a chance. Far too often, as Nam and Grace and Shirley has emphasized, we get caught up in our images of who they are, what we expect them to be based on outside perceptions of media, your neighbors, your preconceived notions, your biases, and we all have these things that happen to us. And one of the major challenges all of us have to overcome is overcome all those items. So take a good, strong look at what's really there. And what's really there, does that kid deserve a chance to grow and excel and perhaps lead? And I am one of those examples, and Grace and Nam and Shirley and others who are working in industries that we do not fit the stereotypes. And, they look past all the biases to give the kid a chance.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And we're going to close with Shirley, any final thoughts to the audience today on our discussion and on the issue we discussed?
I think through this whole episode or the last year of what Asian Americans are gone through, I'm struck by how many people don't know about who we are. And so if you've logged on to this webinar, thank you, because it means you are curious and you're opening your mind and you want to learn more. And so really just spread the word, keep, spread the word about what you've learned today. And again, thank you, Bill, for hosting this. And I hope this spurs other organizations to do the same and not, not ignore what has happened, not to think that this is this will all blow over, in a few months. That this will take years. I mean, to kind of reverse the racism and discrimination against Asian Americans. It will probably take another generation. I think my kids will be dealing with this still when they're all grown up. And so it will take a lot of time. It'll take a lot of intentionality. So, but thank you. This is where it starts.
Yeah. Well, I'm probably one of those folks that maybe ignorant of a lot of the history here until I started listening in forums and reading some things, and so I'm probably in that category. So I appreciate the discussion today, but I just think we do have to. I think the Black Lives Matter and in this movement here have caused an awakening. And we are going to see it again with the Afghanistan refugees who come. That's why I asked Nam that question. It's growing up where I grew up, to see the avenue there change as it did just in Dorchester alone was amazing. The myth issue is one that I asked you guys about, and I appreciate that conversation because my image, you know, you look at some of the folks challenging the Latin school exam, the plaintiffs in that are Asian, along with some other, you know, white Caucasian. The Harvard lawsuit, the plaintiffs in that, these are people who want to succeed and feel they want. It's just a great story. So I want to thank you all for responding to my invitation. Thank you for sharing today, and thank you to my partners and the folks at Nutter, and thanks to everybody on the call. Goodbye now. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye now.
Bye.